All right, hi folks. Welcome. I'm gonna screen share uno segundo. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Wonderful. Okay, hi folks. Welcome. Tonight we're gonna chat about politics and also courts at the end. A few quick disclaimers before we get started. First thing, just in general, is that I'll be probably making jokes about politics, which is probably the riskiest thing to make jokes about. So, it's all in good fun, haha, shits and giggles, all that. Second thing, obviously, I'm biased. I have certain opinions and stuff like that. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. Do I happen to personally believe I'm correct? Yes. Does that mean I am correct? In my opinion, yes, but probably not actually. So take everything I say with a very big grain of salt. Obviously, do your own independent research, yada, yada, yada. Otherwise, that would be sad if you just mindlessly accepted whatever I told you as being correct. Third thing, we have Canadians here and stuff. So I figured that for the Americans here, we have some Americans here. Yeah, at least Sophie, you're American. Like, yeah, we've got some Americans. For the Americans here, I figured that we should start by giving them a quick little lecture about all fun things America, rah patriotism. We love you, America. Land of the free, definitely. Oh, to be clear, this was a meme. I'm not a big American patriot. Anyways, so this is, in my opinion, are the four states that are the funniest. Florida, just search the phrase Florida, man. You'll see what I mean. New Jersey, if the earth was flat, then New Jersey would be right at the edge of it. Texas, I really think it would be so funny if Texas seceded, because then you would call it Texit, which I think would be funny. And then California is kind of funny in lots of ways, but they're really massive and they also are always burning up. So there's like lots of funny things that like states are really bad at or whatever. There was one of these that was like really bad. Oh yeah, like I guess like some of the Midwestern states have funky things, but these are also some other things that states are known for. So like, woohoo. Connecticut over here where I'm from is called New Italy. Not really, but it's because we have a bunch of Italians, and that's why our pizza is so good, I guess. Okay, so we're gonna cover six-ish things. Oops, I forgot to finish these things. Apologies. The question marks are there for a reason. You'll see why later. We're gonna cover structure of American government. Sorry, I know that Canadians, it's like a tiny bit annoying to be like American government, rah, but trust me, it'll be useful. We'll chat about partisanship. We'll chat about elections, courts, criminal justice, current trends. I have a video I filmed that I'll send out to you guys later. Okay, first, before we get into any of that, here's a quick mememized version of American history in case you are unfamiliar with the wonders that is American history. So first of all, America fought a big old revolution because Britain basically did a bunch of fighting and then it was like, oh shit, this is expensive. And then basically made Americans pay taxes, which the Americans did not like. Then after that, America was like low-key maybe going to lose. But then they were like, hey, France, do you want to help us fight against Britain? And France is like a middle school bully and is like, are we fighting Britain? Hell yeah. Then we won. Then we wrote a constitution that's really funky. It's one of the shorter constitutions in the world. It's not the shortest. I think Indonesia is the shortest, but it's still pretty short. Then we formed political parties, even though Georgie Washington was like, don't form political parties. And then we formed political parties. Then there was a big nullification crisis, which is odd. Then we, had a whole bunch of genocides, a lot of them. There was like a lot of genocides in American history. Many of them are ongoing. Then we fought a really massive civil war, which eventually resulted in the abolition of slavery. Then we mega fucked up Reconstruction. Here's Andrew Johnson. He is probably one of the worst presidents to ever exist and to be in this country. Then I added another meme for Reconstruction because we effed it up that bad. So that's not great. Then we broke up some monopolies. Then we got involved in World War One. Then we had a big old Great Depression, which was really bad for the global economy. Then we joined World War Two, and then we fought the Cold War. So any questions on American history, folks? That was mostly meant to be a meme, to be clear. I'm not actually expecting that to suffice as like a full-scale lecture of American history. But if anyone has American history questions, I suppose you could ask them. Okay, American government, how it works. There's three main things that the American government is based upon from a kind of principled. Oh yeah, Jeffrey, go ahead.
What happened during the tariff thing?
Oh, the nullification crisis. Where is it? This thing. Basically, there was a tariff that got imposed, the Tariff of Abominations in I think 1828. Then South Carolina was basically like, we will not do the tariff. And then Andrew Jackson was like, hang on, what? So there was this big like nullification crisis because the state didn't want to do a thing that the federal government told them to do. So then we had to send in the military, and then South Carolina got all freaked out. It was like, fine, we'll do it. And they eventually repealed the tariff. Then like 3 decades later, the South seceded anyway. So it kind of ended up not being a huge thing. Okay, good question. Structure of American government, how it works. I'm going to keep this short because it's boring. 3 main principles that govern the United States. Federalism, which basically means that you have a split between the federal government, state governments, and local governments. Separation of powers, which basically says that you have 3 separate branches, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Checks and balances basically mean that all 3 of those branches have some capacity to limit the power of each other branch. No one branch has an excessive amount of power because America is obsessed with the word tyranny. Quick opinion / side note / rant. I hate the phrase tyranny of the majority. It's just a personal opinion. You don't need to take it, but it's such an annoying phrase because it's like used to death. And then when people whip it out in debate, it's so annoying. Anyways, in terms of what these things actually mean for debate, though, the principle of federalism is pretty useful whenever you have debates that more or less are about devolving power to local levels of government. The generally common argument you'll hear in favor of more local forms of government is that the larger and larger a government becomes, the more and more diluted representation is. That's why, for example, even in a body like the United Nations that is at least theoretically democratic, in the sense that countries have representation, it's not as the case that like small countries ever really have a meaningful degree of say or influence, because the larger a federal government is, the more and more diluted your specific kind of unit of representation becomes. Conversely, there's arguments as to why federal authorities just tend to be better in the sense that they often are better funded, better resourced. There's also more media scrutiny on federal governments, which means that they're often more likely to be called out for things like corruption and more likely to implement good policies, etc. Separation of powers and checks and balances, whenever you argue about these things, the general trade-off that you often discuss is basically accountability versus efficiency in some regard. So, for example, executive orders might be a nice instance where the president in the United States basically more or less gets to legislate functionally, not entirely. And a bunch of constitutional experts would hack my head off for saying that. But the benefit of executive orders is that presidents get to do things really quickly. The trade-off is it comes probably at the expense of doing the whole separation of powers thingy-madoodly-bob-doo. Like the president probably isn't supposed to be doing that, albeit more efficiently. Anyways, that's the kind of boring stuff out of the way. There's 4 things we're going to talk about within this section: Congress, White House, courts, and then constitutions, which I think are very fun. Congress. Wait, hang on. Let me see if I can play this. Hang on. Hang on. I want to see if I can screen share this. This is absolutely so not important, literally at all, in literally any way, shape, and form. But I love this video. Let me see if I'm not sure if the audio is going to work because it's really annoying on my computer. Let's see. No, I don't think so. Oh wait, maybe it is. Can you hear that?
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that's...
Okay, watch this video after. It's very funny. I think it's Schoolhouse Rock, which is like really funny. It's just a song about how bills become laws in the United States, which is kind of fun. Anyways, no, skip, move. Okay, Congress, how does it work? The way that Congress, this is also vaguely similar-ish to Parliament in Canada and also Parliament in Britain and also parliaments in general. The way that Congress basically works, I won't spend a ton of time on this because it's boring, but basically the gist is bills are like laws, but they're not actually laws yet because they haven't been voted on. They start as some sort of idea. Subsequently, a representative within Congress/Parliament writes up an idea into a formal bill. Subsequently, they're assigned to a committee or a subcommittee, which basically specializes in some specific area, say agriculture or the Department of Defense. That committee is composed of members of Congress who are sort of well-versed in that specific area. That committee studies the bill, they consult experts, they do a whole bunch of amending of the bill, they modify the bill, yada, yada, yada. In case the committee is like, yes, this bill is good, there is the chance that it can move to the floor of the Senate/House. Subsequently, within the House/Senate, it can be debated, it can be amended, you subsequently have a vote. If it is voted on by both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, then woohoo, hooray, hurrah, the bill passes forward. The president then has 10 days to sign it into law. And if not, then technically it does pass through. Otherwise, the president can veto it, which is very sad. This is the more interesting stuff that's a little bit less stock, generic civics class stuff. there's a lot of reasons why Congress is kind of not great in a lot of instances when it comes to passing policies. These are kind of three of the very common instances of where legislation within Congress tends to be quite funky. The first thing that you'll sometimes read about are things called policy riders. So basically the idea of policy riders, which to be clear to Canadians, fully different from ridings, like the concept of political districts, fully different things. The concept of riders is basically sometimes you'll have a bill that in and of itself will not pass through to Congress because there isn't enough support for it. And there will sometimes also be another bill that also would not pass through Congress on its own, but there will sort of be a form of political horse trading where more or less what happens is the party that supports Bill A will be like, hey, we'll pass this thing if you also agree to pass our thing, but we'll also lend support to your bill. These are often lumped together simply because it's easier to pass a bill as a whole, and oftentimes because it's just easier to just vote on it all at once. So the kind of odd thing about policy riders is that you end up getting bills like the Affordable Care Act, for instance, which is a healthcare reform act that also inexplicably includes an entire section on student debt reform, which is obviously totally different. And the reason why policy riders are often put in is because it simply increases efficiency, and it's often one of the sort of key tactics that's used within political negotiations to get otherwise non-passable laws to pass through. Pork barrel spending is another kind of common issue that comes up whenever you're trying to pass legislation. The idea of pork barrel spending basically is you'll have people within Congress, within Parliament, who basically want to apportion or appropriate government funds for local spending projects back home that probably don't really benefit anyone other than that district. The obvious question you might be asking yourself is like, well, isn't that all laws? Like, isn't every representative just trying to benefit their own district? And that's true, but in most instances within federal legislative bodies like Congress or Parliament, the general goal of those institutions in most instances is to pass federal laws or national level laws, things that improve aggregate economic outcomes or protect rights in many different states, that sort of thing. Pork barrel spending is when you do something that kind of just exclusively benefits your own district, almost entirely for political reasons. The kind of best example of this is there was this guy, Ted Stevens, who was from Alaska, which is like basically like the cousin of Russia, except it's America. And basically what he basically did was he got like $200 million-ish of US federal government spending to build a bridge that literally goes basically nowhere. It connects a small community of 50 people to the rest of Alaska. It costs somewhere in the ballpark of like $500 million to build the bridge in its entirety. And the only reason he did it was because it was wildly politically popular at home, served zero economic benefit, probably for Alaska and definitely for the United States. So the classic problem with pork barrel spending is it often results in the appropriation of funds for like locally politically good projects that are just a waste of money. Special interest groups we'll chat about in a quick second. The kind of stat I put in here that's interesting is like basically more or less special interest groups just influence Congress through things like lobbying. It is an incredibly rich industry, and there's a huge kind of trend of people who leave Congress and then go into things like lobbying or things like special interest groups and get paid a lot of the cha-ching, and they make a lot of money that way. So given that, this is a few more kind of main problems that come up within any sort of legislative body. As a quick debate side note, these are often really good things to think about how you might fix in politics debates. So whenever you, for example, have motions about like campaign finance reform or motions about changing electoral systems or anything like that, it can often be a useful strategy to be like, here is a problem with democracy. How does this motion affect it? So for example, if you have a motion that's like, this house would ban politicians from running for any more than 2 terms in office, maybe you might identify something like say incumbency advantage, and then talk about why you make the problem of incumbency advantage better and why that's a good thing. So what are these problems? First problem is campaign finance. The gist is that running a campaign costs a lot of money, but more important than that is the fact that running a good campaign costs a lot of money. And the main reason for that is because in order to win elections, especially in the modern era, you need to have things like people knocking on doors. You need to have things like massive advertising campaigns. And you also need to hire political consultants who have all of the fancy insights on here are the types of policies you really want to pitch. Here's the specific things you want to be hyping up that's most likely to get you elected. All of these things cost money, and they cost a lot of money. And that means that in order to win an election, you overwhelmingly need to be the better funded campaign. quick side note, this 90% statistic thing is an interesting stat. I'll explain this in a second when we talk about incumbency advantage. It might, to some extent, be more correlatory than causal, but it's still a pretty good metric that in 90% of cases, the candidate that wins an election is just the candidate that has more money. The obvious issue, though, is that you just don't get money out of nowhere. Some governments have publicly subsidized or publicly financed election systems where basically all, for example, candidates are given free airtime or all candidates are given money from the government. But in the United States, that's not the case, and you have a large degree of corporate influence. Here's the problem, and I want you to all think about this for a quick second. If someone gives you a crap ton of money to run a campaign, and you win the campaign, when you come into office, are you likely to do things that are good or bad for that donor? The answer is obviously good. It's just basic human psychology. And in many instances, money is often given on the explicit condition that when you win a seat in, say, parliament, you'll then use your power to vote in policies which are favorable to that donor. The obvious then problem with this system is that insofar as the institutions that have the most money to donate to campaigns tend to be richer people and corporations, it gives those groups disproportionate influence over the political system. So that then leads into kind of the specific campaign finance problems in the United States. Citizens United is a very common Supreme Court case that you'll hear referenced in regards to campaign finance. The basic gist of what Citizens United did in the United States was legally recognize money as a form of speech. This is very precedentially significant because once you recognize money as a form of speech, you now have to extend First Amendment protections for speech, which necessarily means that now if I'm a corporation, if I'm an individual person, if I'm more or less anyone that has money, I have a pretty reasonable constitutional claim that since my money is in of itself a form of speech, I have a lot of protections for what I can do with that speech. And it's very, very difficult for the government to stop me from using that money, i.e. speech, in a way that I want. What this basically has led to is a very large capacity for fairly powerful interest groups, like corporations, for instance, to very heavily affect the political system. And the two most common ways this happens are through things called PACs or super PACs. PACs, basically, I think the best way to think of it would kind of be like more or less a bunch of people just pooling money together, and then you give that money to a political campaign. So it would be like a bunch of debaters being like, we love Justin Trudeau, and then getting a bunch of money together from a bunch of debaters, and then like going to Justin Trudeau and being like, here's a bunch of money, Justin Trudeau. Super PACs are arguably more pernicious. Super PACs can accept money from corporations, from unions, and from a lot of what's called dark money, which basically is where it's very difficult, if not altogether impossible, to disclose where that money came from. Super PACs basically have very little limitations in terms of how much money you can contribute. There are limitations on PACs. They're far less significant in the context of super PACs. But the crucial kind of distinction between PACs versus super PACs is that super PACs are not legally allowed to give money directly to campaigns, but you can still spend it on behalf of a campaign. So for example, if I ran for president and all of you wanted to support my candidacy, maybe you couldn't directly give money to me if you were corporations, but you could use a bunch of money to run ads that support me. That's basically what a super PAC more or less is able to do. Yeah, Jeffrey?
What's the point of a PAC if people can just donate to the candidate?
Yeah, largely speaking, it's because the idea behind a PAC is that you're pooling special interests together. So the idea of a political action committee is that you have a bunch of people with a similar interest. If all of you individually just donate like $5 to a candidate, it's very hard to be like, hey, dude, I gave you $5. Now please pass this massive act of legislation. It's much easier if you can have a bunch of people collectively donate money to a campaign and then say, we will give this money to you on the condition that you, for example, support XYZ type of regulation or XYZ type of legislation in the future. The second main problem with most legislative bodies, but in particular the United States, is basically population disparities. I live in Connecticut. There are two things that make Connecticut pretty cool. The first thing that makes us very cool is that we are the nutmeg state. I don't even like nutmeg, but it sounds really cool. The second thing that makes Connecticut cool is that in 1787, by we, I mean one delegate representing Connecticut, Roger Sherman, basically came up with this thing called the Connecticut Compromise. Basically, the gist was that at the Constitutional Convention in the United States, there were a bunch of people from small states that were like, oh God, we can't base the Congress off of just population because then we'll have no power. But then a bunch of big states were like, no, but we can't just base it off of whether or not you're a state, because then we have no power. And then, like, brilliantly, Connecticut was like, well, why don't we just do it both ways? So what this basically means is the United States has a bicameral system. It has a Senate, which gives 2 seats to all states. It has a House of Representatives that allocates seats based on population. In order for a bill to become law, it has to pass through both. Now, the problem with this is basically that the Senate ends up being a very demographically unrepresentative body. So, for example, in Wyoming, which is the least populous state in the entire country, every one senator from Wyoming represents 150,000 people, which on the flip side basically means that more or less the amount of political power per one given to a voter in Wyoming compared to the most populous state in the US, which is California. If you're a voter in Wyoming, you per capita have way more political influence. If you're in California, 712,000 people, basically, more or less, kind of like get represented. The difference in a state like Wyoming is that you just have way more direct influence over representation. So basically, more or less, the concept is that when you have the Senate, which allocates seats based on just statehood as opposed to population, you end up getting very disproportionate outcomes. So by 2040, it's something like 70-ish% of the entire US population is going to have about 30 Senate seats, basically. And there's a bunch of really kind of small, random-ass Midwestern, predominantly white states that end up having a huge chunk of influence because they all get 2 votes in the Senate, but they all also happen to be relatively small in population. The third big problem with Congress is called gerrymandering. The way that gerrymandering works is basically this. For every legislative body except the Senate, more or less what you do, and this happens in other countries as well, but the United States is really special and cool and unique and exceptional. So we have special, unique, exceptional problems. Like, for example, notably bad partisan gerrymandering. Basically, the way that gerrymandering works is that for every legislative body except the Senate, you have to draw political districts to represent to basically figure out / determine what representatives are representing what groups of people. Obviously, though, there's a bunch of different ways that you can consider drawing those districts. Some of them are fair, some of them are heavily unfair. So this is kind of like a snippet of what this looks like. If you have a district that has 60% orange voters and 40% purple voters, it is theoretically possible, even though in theory, this overall group of people should on net have more orange representation than purple representation. It's possible to draw your districts in such a way that purple ends up getting a majority of seats, even though they're only 40% of the voting population. So the basically more or less the issue with partisan gerrymandering is that it makes otherwise competitive districts non-competitive simply because the party that controls the state legislature has a self-interest to basically redesign the electoral map in a way that favors that state, or that party rather. Quick note, to be clear, I'm very leftist, but like, it is not true that only Republicans do this. Democrats do it as well. It's not really true that only one side of the party only one side of the spectrum uses gerrymandering. Both sides do it, and it's just bad from a normative perspective, even if from your own party's perspective, it's either good or bad in some instances. Filibustering is the next kind of big issue, specifically with the Senate. The Senate has a bunch of very weird esoteric rules, but basically one of the rules, more or less, is that there's no cap on the amount of time that you can spend debating an issue, which is like it would more or less be the equivalent of if like parliamentary debate didn't have speaking times. Like everyone would speak for like 4 hours and you'd be like, now moving on to my 722nd subpoint or whatever. I guess that might just be me, but like you get the gist. Like the point is like if you don't have caps on the amount of time you can debate, it goes on for a really long time. So basically the gist is that in order to basically stop debate, you more or less have to have a motion for cloture, which basically just means we stop debate and we go to vote. The problem is that really oddly, in the Senate, most laws only need 51 votes to pass. But in order to stop debate, you need 60 votes. So obviously the idea is if you're the sort of opposing party that's in the minority, you can basically threaten to just drag debate out ad infinitum. It's called a filibuster, because you're basically going to stop a vote from ever being held. And the only way to stop that debate from occurring, which is the prerequisite to ever moving into voting procedure, is to get 60 votes, which is more votes than you would need to even pass the bill in the first instance. What this means in practice is that most bills in the Senate will not pass unless they have 60 votes, because you just literally can't get around the filibuster. Now, ironically, there's actually a way that you could theoretically possibly eliminate the filibuster without actually being subject to the filibuster, which is weird. There's basically a very weird Senate procedure where you could kind of actually ironically bypass the filibuster to then abolish the filibuster. So probably a motion you'll debate at some point this fall, I would guess, is like this House is the Democrats would advocate against the filibuster / abolish the filibuster, something that gets debated quite a lot. That being said, there is kind of a pathway around the filibuster in the US Senate, and it's called budget reconciliation. This is really weird, but basically not all bills that the Senate can pass are subject to the filibuster. One exception is any act or bill, basically, that involves spending, raising or lowering taxes, or the federal debt limit, also called the debt ceiling. Basically, what you can do in the Senate is you can try to sneak like little mini bills basically into budgetary laws or budgetary acts. And since these acts are not subject to the filibuster rules, you can pass them with just 51 votes. So you can do the whole budget reconciliation thing a lot. You're limited basically to more or less doing it 3 times a year, but in most instances it only happens 1 time a year. This is the best way that you can get around the whole issue of, you need 60 votes by just going through budget reconciliation. Next issue is voter suppression. TLDR, if you're a party, the way that you win votes is by getting people to vote for you and by not making people vote for the other side. If there's a group of people that consistently vote for the other side, you have a pretty good incentive to just try to make it harder for them to vote. There's a bunch of bills in the United States right now that are trying to do that in some capacity, like trying to make it more difficult for members of certain groups, like, for example, Black voters in Georgia to vote. A lot of these things actually are, just when you think about them, like just gut check kind of weirdly bad. So, for example, Montana is basically passed a bill that abolishes what's called same-day voter registration, which basically means you can go to the polls and then sign up to vote. And the debate they had over the bill, like whether or not they should abolish same-day voter registration, like the 3rd minute of debate, one of the sponsors of the bill was like, yeah, we only want this bill because the people who register as same-day voters tend to be Democrats, and it was a Republican-sponsored bill. So in lots of instances, it's not even that disguised that voter suppression is trying to suppress voters. And also voter suppression is bad. Boo-hoo, we don't like voter suppression. So no voters, woo, we don't like you. Boo, voter suppression, very sad. Woohoo, don't do that. First past the post, FPTP. So the gist is the United States is one of, and there's a lot of countries that do this, but the United States is a country that has a voting system that basically features a winner-take-all system, which basically means that the candidate who gets the most votes wins the election. There's a lot of reasons why that's arguably good or arguably bad, but the kind of main reason it ends up being bad in the United States is 2 things. The first is, a lot of people ask questions like, why can't we have a 3-party system in the United States? Wouldn't it be great if we had like a centrist party that could like represent everyone and make everyone happy? The problem is that it's very, very difficult to ever have a viable 3rd party in the United States, which is why if you look at US history, there is probably at most like maybe 30 years of American history that could credibly be characterized as having viable 3rd parties. And the reason why is that the first past the post voting system makes it very hard for 3rd parties to ever establish themselves. So here's the analogy that I think kind of makes this pretty clear. Let's say that you are a voter in the United States and there's 3 parties that you're considering: Republicans, Democrats, and let's say the Green Party. Just on a gut check, like, let's say that your strongest preference is for the Green Party. Like, you self-identify as very environmentally friendly. You always turn the lights off. You don't keep the bathwater running. You shut off the faucet when you brush your teeth. You want to vote for the Green Party. Just on a gut check, do you think that the Green Party is more closely aligned with Democrats or Republicans? Just like anyone, like gut check.
Democrats?
Yeah,
Democrats.
exactly. So most likely you would prefer, like, if you're a Green voter, you prefer Greens to Democrats, but you also prefer Democrats to Republicans. The weird thing about first past the post systems is that if you vote for the Green Party, the problem is that if you didn't vote for the Green Party, you realistically would have voted for the Democratic Party, which implicitly means that when you vote for Greens and not Democrats, what you're basically implicitly doing is taking away a vote from the Green Party, or sorry, taking away a vote from the Democratic Party, and instead giving it to the Greens. The problem is the Greens are going to get like 3% of the vote share. So you're basically more or less bluntly a little bit throwing away your vote because you're voting for a party that's never going to win. But because there's a winner-take-all system, the only real thing that matters is who gets more votes, Democrats or Republicans. So when you vote for Greens and not for Democrats, what you're implicitly doing is taking a vote away from the Democrats and therefore implicitly advantaging Republicans. And what that means on a large enough scale is that the implication of a winner-take-all system is that over time, the Republicans start to win elections, the Greens never win elections, and the Democrats lose more often than they would have if you had simply voted Democrat. And since your original preference was Green number 1, Democrat number 2, Republican number 3, the irony of a first past the post system is that in voting for the Green Party, your first preferred option, you end up implicitly resulting in a sort of party coming to power that you dislike the most. So in voting for Greens, you ended up implicitly voting for Republicans. So instead of getting a Democratic politician in office, you get an even worse Republican in office. That's kind of one of the main issues with first past the post voting systems. There's some momentum in the US to change that. So like Maine, for example, has some districts that now use what's called ranked choice voting, which is very fun. Andrew Yang campaigned on it a while ago. Lots of different districts consider it. Basically, it's a system that to some extent is more willing to consider your ranked choices. So like I would prefer candidate X over candidate Y over candidate Z. And the idea is that it better aggregates and therefore like reflects popular preferences, so on and so forth. The other thing that plagues the Senate and the Congress in particular is what's called incumbency advantage. What this basically means is that if I'm a politician currently in office and I choose to run for re-election, I have a bunch of advantages over my opponents. First, I just have established financial connections. I know who my donors are. I already have money. Second, I get to claim the benefits of experience that a newcomer or a challenger can't. And even if we as debaters are like, oh, this doesn't matter, a lot of voters do at the end of the day care about the idea of voting for someone who has the ability to get stuff done, even if they don't. Third is just name brand recognition. Just trivially, like cognitive biases are a thing. And when you see someone's name a lot again and again and again in the press, it means that you know who they are. You, on average, might be more inclined to trust them. There's also this weird thing called franking privileges, which bluntly is bizarre. Basically, the US adopted this norm from Britain that basically says that you as a US congressperson get to send out mail for free. And at some point, a bunch of American representatives were like, let's just send out a bunch of advertising mail for free, which they get to do. The kind of main implication of this is that even when elections on face seem fair, they're often implicitly not, because there's always a massive advantage afforded to incumbents. And incumbents win something like 90 to 95% of elections they run for. And this is really ironic, because in most instances, someone guessed, like roughly on average, what the overall approval rating of the Congress is in the United States, like in a generally good, like average period of time. Jeffrey.
20%.
Yeah, it's somewhere around that. It's like it's not that rare to have like 15% approval ratings for Congress. Think about this. The public likes Congress at a rate of 15% and then votes for incumbents at a rate of 90%, right? I think it just demonstrates that even when Congress is widely reviled, the benefits of incumbency advantage are so intense that people are still willing to consistently vote for the same person again and again and again. That's why you have people who have like literally been in the Senate for like, I think thousands of years practically. So that's Congress and problems with Congress. Presidency, the kind of boring stuff. The president has a lot of power. It's worth flagging, though, that the presidency didn't always have a lot of power. Beginning probably around Lincoln, the presidency gained more and more power. So Lincoln, for example, suspended habeas corpus unilaterally, which is kind of one of the first very major instances of presidents doing something very, very powerful without explicit support from Congress. There were instances before that, like, for example, like the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson, but like Abraham Lincoln started the trend, arguably. It accelerated a ton under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is basically like, executive orders are my thing. And he just like went to town on executive orders. And since then, the presidency has arguably grown to a large extent. There's a bunch of things that presidents can do. The biggest one I want to flag is executive orders, which basically is the closest thing that presidents can do to actually legislate. The kind of classic argument for them is just they're efficient. So to the extent that presidents have relatively good incentives, i.e. re-election prospects, they want to reflect well on their party, it is just the fastest way to get shit done. Conversely, they're also probably a violation of the principle of separation of powers. So everyone put a big F in chat for Jefferson. Quick side note, I think that the funniest thing that you can do is to call founding fathers by like more informal versions of their name. So don't call him George Washington, call him Georgie Washington. He's not Thomas Jefferson, he's Tommy Jefferson. It just makes them sound so much funnier. Other thing, I'm sure probably all of you have heard of this, but the Electoral College exists. It's really fucking weird and no one really knows why we keep using it. It's odd. But the major implication of the existence of the Electoral College is basically just that some states end up having a huge amount of influence. So the largest state in the United States is California. California in the last 3 presidential elections has had almost 0 visits from presidential candidates. Why? Because everyone knows it's going to vote Democrat. No one is seriously thinking, oh, I think it's really likely that California is about to flip red. And so what that means is that some states, again, because of that winner-take-all system, have asymmetric importance in elections. So states like, for example, Georgia, states like, for example, Florida, or Pennsylvania, or Michigan, or Wisconsin, are states that matter a lot, in the sense that they are battlegrounds. They could swing Republican, they could swing Democrat. And there's a lot of states that are increasingly leaning purple. So states like Colorado or Georgia, for example, are states that are increasingly shifting away from maybe historical republicanism and becoming more and more purple, i.e. they're not always going to vote blue, they're not always going to vote red, i.e. Democrat or Republican, but they're a bit more up in the air. That means that campaign resources tend to be targeted towards those states because that's where the bang for your buck simply tends to be the greatest. The other thing I just want to quickly flag about the whole presidential system, a lot of liberal democracies, Australia is a good example of this, pick candidates for office through a selection system internal to parties. So party elites will pick who runs in elections. The US is quite different in the sense that the US, especially for major elections like the presidential races, has a system of primaries, caucuses also. Caucuses are bizarre. It's basically where you have people physically go into a room and then like self-select into corners and do multiple rounds of voting until you like literally physically have that entire polling area vote for a candidate, basically. But the main gist, more or less, is just that the US has a primary system, which means that voters get to dictate who ends up running within the general election. That being said, the party has a lot of influence. CF 2016 with Bernie and Hillary. Feel free to read more about that, etc. Okay, these are also some presidents that you might want to know about. I wrote up a big thing on American history. Feel free to read that in case you're really obsessed. Okay, courts. We're going to cover all of the really fun court stuff later, and trust me, boy, it's going to be fun. Just a few quick notes on courts overarchingly. So the general trend within Supreme Court confirmation hearings is that they have become increasingly controversial and increasingly polarized. If you look at even pre-1990s, a huge number of Supreme Court confirmations were either unanimous or very close to unanimous, Democrats and Republicans voting jointly. Perhaps the biggest thing that's changed is that courts have increasingly become a political instrument, which parties view as a part of their sort of effort to grab power. And so as courts have increasingly addressed very political questions, so things like desegregation, environmentalism, contraception, all those types of things, there's also been an added political incentive to put relatively political individuals onto courts. So that's why, for example, if you look at things like the rushing of Amy Coney Barrett through the confirmation process towards the tail end of 2020, it was explicitly because Republicans desperately wanted to get another justice onto the court to be able to do things like, for example, overturn Roe. We're going to quickly walk through all of the major, all of the Supreme Court justices, not extensively, but just so you know they are. We're going to do a guessing game. You're going to guess their political affiliation. John Roberts, is he a liberal or conservative? What do people think? Let's see what people are saying. All right, everyone's saying conservative. Yeah, he's a conservative. Everyone say hi. Hi, John Roberts. That's a conservative. All right. So, Mayor, what are we thinking? Liberal, Democrat, progressive, liberal? Yeah, you got it. Liberal leaning indeed. Clarence Thomas. Conservative as fuck. Yeah, this dude is really, really conservative. Like, he's so conservative that He himself is a member of an interracial couple, and there's strong rumors that he himself might potentially legally overturn the constitutional protection for interracial couples. He was the person who, in his decision affirming the overturning of Roe, explicitly was like, well, maybe we will potentially consider overthrowing other precedents, like, for example, contraception, yada, yada. Amy Coney Barrett, recently confirmed. Conservative. Actually, you guys got this one wrong. She's actually known as the notorious ACB. She's widely agreed upon as one of the largest, most powerful liberal icons within recent contemporary American history. It's widely been said that Amy Coney Barrett is probably one of the singularly greatest things that ever happened to Democrats. She's a very powerful liberal icon. She's consistently ruled in line with the most hardline leftist advocacy as possible. I mean, it's really remarkable just how incredibly liberal she's been, widely known as being more progressive than even her predecessor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So, just kidding, guys. She's very, very conservative, very conservative. All right, Samuel Alito, if you had to guess. Let's see what people are saying. Yeah, this dude's conservative. This dude's conservative as fuck. Kagan. That was the name of my 10th grade history textbook. Kagan. Yeah, liberal. Yeah, exactly. Neil Gorsuch. This man's eyes he looks so dead inside. I mean, like, what is going on, man? What is going on, man? You want to talk? Gorsuch leans conservative. He's not as conservative as other members of the court, but certainly like leans a little bit conservative. Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah, he is ugly. Yeah, he's ugly. He's bad. Yeah, he's a bad human being. That man is a bad human being. Yeah, you're right, Emily. He just like radiates liberal progressive energy. I also think he has an incredibly punchable face, you know, like that, like very well proportioned punchable face. Okay, anyone want to guess? She was appointed by Biden, so you know, you should be, yeah, this was just in the news. Yeah, she's liberal. So there's currently a 6-3 conservative lean on the court. Arguably, wait, let me go back a little bit. Arguably, Roberts is, some people, ever since he's been confirmed, if you go back and read like reports from when he was first confirmed, everyone's been like, maybe Roberts will be really, really like a swing vote. Like he might maybe be, and like he's less on the conservative end in the sense that he favors more incremental change, but he still very much is conservative. So he's kind of the closest thing to a swing vote there is on the Supreme Court. But outside of that, yeah. I'm going to skip this stuff. The main thing I just want to emphasize is that a key tenet of Republican strategy under McConnell, which is, you know, say what you will about Republicans, but they've executed the strategy very well, even though it's had terrible implications. Republicans have been very, very focused on ensuring that the federal courts skew conservative. They often try to put people who come from the Federalist Society, which basically is a very conservative, right-leaning group of lawyers, and they've been quite successful at that. Okay, fourth thing here is going to be constitutions, then we're going to move on. U.S. Constitution, basically just, if the U.S. Constitution could win an award, it would probably win an award for being the most tragically vague document, which means two things. One, how courts interpret the Supreme Court matters a lot, and also amendments matter a lot, because the gaps in the Constitution are subsequently filled either through legal interpretation or through constitutional amendments. A few amendments you should know about. First Amendment, speech. Second Amendment, guns. Pew, pew. Fourth Amendment, basically privacy. You know, like you don't get like searched and seized. Fifth, sixth, and seventh kind of all have to do collectively with your rights as an accused person who's accused of crime. So things like, for example, protections against double jeopardy, protections against self-incrimination, right to trial by jury. Eighth Amendment protects you against cruel and unusual punishment. 13th Amendment ended slavery. 14th Amendment gave citizenship to Black people. 15th Amendment ensures that you can't discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to voting. Then the 19th Amendment was like, oh, wait, but we forgot about half of the American population. Then they gave the right to vote to women. Then the 25th Amendment, God hope never, the fourth clause never gets invoked. 25th Amendment is basically a whole messy series of processes for how you would replace the president, especially in instances where the president is unwilling to step down, but probably should be taken out of office. Okay, so that is TLDR, how the American government works. Wow, so exciting. Fantastic, exciting. Questions on any of that, folks? Wow, that's impressive. Adrian, are you still in Europe?
No, I'm in Boston now.
Okay, that's good. I was going to say otherwise. I would probably say you should go to sleep, just because, it would be like a casual 4 a.m. Anyways, okay, partisan politics, i.e. parties in the United States. Quick side note, a lot of this information it's probably not immediately useful in debate, but it's very good to know. Also, feeling like you know something is generally a good thing. So the gist is that in the United States, there's a very dominant two-party system. Most first-past-the-post voting systems tend to have two fairly strong parties. You can think, for example, like liberals and Tories, for instance, within like Britain, for example. But main gist is that there's a lot of instances where liberals and conservatives in the United States especially are not politically vying with each other. And one of the most obvious examples of that, especially in the modern era, is basically the rural-urban split. Urban areas overwhelmingly vote Democrat. So even if you look at very, very, very red-leaning states, arguably Texas, although they've arguably shifted more Democrat recently of late, Texas, the rural areas will always vote Republican. No one's going to really doubt that. But urban areas, like, for example, Houston or Dallas, those places will vote blue by a really, really large margin. So on average, even within Democrat majority states in rural areas, you tend to have a larger dominance of conservatives. Urban areas tend to skew a largely bit more Democrat in city areas. A few other things just to quickly flag about parties in general. The United States, to some extent, has enormous strong party discipline, but it's much stronger within most parliamentary systems. The idea of strong party discipline is basically just the idea that when the party establishes like a position on, for example, a proposed piece of legislation, everyone in the party falls in line and votes accordingly. The main reason this happens, especially within parliamentary systems that have coalitions composed of multiple parties, is that you need to have all people within the party vote in the same way to ever get anything done. If you don't do that, you get fragmented coalitions, you don't get legislation passed, etc. Within the United States, though, there's something more of a norm of, like, to be clear, strong party discipline happens, but there's still often people like Joe Manchin within the Democratic Party, who we'll chat about in a second, who very oftentimes will kind of be a little bit rogue and kind of be a little bit weird. The other thing to note about general political parties in the United States is that since the 90s in particular, polarization has increased a lot. Specifically, it's been driven by factors like social media. It's been driven by the rise of negative campaigning, which basically is, instead of a candidate being like, vote for me, it's like, don't vote for them, which is like a weird debate strategy, but it also works. And so I guess it works in campaigns as well. And basically what that means is that since the 90s, there's been a relative shift of the Democrats towards the leftist end of the spectrum and the Republicans towards the right end of the spectrum. In terms of the Democratic Party, a couple of quick things I'll flag. I think you guys know this, but Democrats tend to favor liberalism in general. That means things like social safety nets. That means things like progressive attitudes towards social issues, affordable education, healthcare, yada, yada, yada. There's a few things that the Democrats are divided on. The first, and probably the largest one, is that there's a very large fragmentation within the Democratic Party between center leftism and more intense progressive forms of leftism. So people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, the Squad, have risen around a very hardcore conception. And when I say hardcore conception, I'm talking in relative terms here. A lot of what even Bernie advocates for would be considered borderline conservative, even within a lot of relatively European states. But TLDR, at least in the confines of American politics, you have a lot of fairly left-leaning politicians who have emerged within the Democratic Party. The other main thing that a lot of Democrats relatedly are divided on is basically attitudes towards things like norms within Congress. So, for example, do we add Puerto Rico as a state just to get 2 more Senate seats that vote Democrat? Do we do things like pack the court, which means that we add more justices to the Supreme Court? And there's also a decent bit of division over things like, to what extent should Democrats accept sort of tainted money? Like, to what extent, for example, should we have people like Pete Buttigieg accepting money from billionaires and stuff like that? The other thing vis-a-vis the Democratic Party in general is that Democrats often have historically, at least since the 1960s or so, appealed to relatively more progressive voters and especially marginalized groups. 2 things I want to say here, though. The first thing is, it's not actually true in the United States that anyone who's not white votes Democrat. So, for example, Cuban migrants in Florida overwhelmingly vote Republican. And there's a lot of, for example, Hispanic communities in places like even like Arizona, for instance, that will often vote Republican. There are, however, certain key constituencies that will almost always vote Democrat. So, for example, in the past like 60 years, in a presidential election, the highest percentage of the black vote that a Republican candidate has ever got was 13%. So, like, at least generally, Democrats consistently get votes from marginalized groups in that sense. That being said, the kind of second thing I want to flag vis-a-vis like leftism, Democrats, et cetera, is that there's a very large extent to which the Democrats are not inherently good for minorities. And what I mean by that is that there's been a lot of factors that have contributed to a lot of progressive complacency within the Democratic Party. One of the perhaps most overlooked ones is that as union membership has declined in the United States, so too has the power of the singularly most powerful institution that has historically checked back against the liberal parties, i.e. unions. There's also other things like the fact that there's been demographic shifts in the United States, the fact that you have to water down policies to pass them through a very politically gridlocked Senate, yada, yada. Last thing, and we're going to do a quick exercise after this, so get excited to case, woohoo, woohoo. As I flagged before, the kind of general trend within the Democratic Party hasn't just been the rise of political figures like Bernie, for instance. It's also been the rise of leftist political advocacy, like, for example, the Green New Deal. So this is something that gets set a decent bit in a lot of motions, even if it's a bit disguised. And basically, the clash almost always comes down to what extent is political radicalism a good thing? So the first kind of, we're going to do a few of these tonight, a few kind of like worked group examples. The first thing we're going to chat a little bit about is basically just this motion, this House regrets the rise of the far left in liberal democracies. So take a second if you want to think about it, although I guess I did like a little bit tell you to think about it earlier. So homework. But we're going to just sketch out some argument ideas here. I'll send out cases later on these motions afterwards in case you're curious on my takes. But we're just going to chat about generic ways of approaching this type of motion and general strategies that you might consider employing when it comes to trying to come up with strategies for how you would approach these sorts of motions and all of that sort of exciting stuff. Okay, let's just spend 2 minutes on gov, and then we'll spend like a minute or two on op, and then we'll move on because we've got a lot to get through. Okay, any ideas that folks want to talk about on gov, like potential arguments as to why the rise of far leftism is bad? Charles.
It just creates deadlock within political parties, so you just don't pass anything.
Okay, sure. So maybe there's an argument that says that when you get increased levels of partisanship and fairly radical conceptions of leftism, it's harder within parties to actually get change passed, for sure. Wait, I thought someone else raised their hand. Oops, maybe I misremembered. Other thoughts? Adrian, go ahead, fire away.
To the average voter, it makes the liberal party seem more radical. It makes it easier for conservatives to attack it.
Yeah, so this probably decreases support for moderate leftism, and to the extent that maybe we might disagree over the extent to which far leftism is good or bad, but we can probably agree that maybe center leftism is better. This takes away from the support of those institutions, for sure. Caden, yeah. Sir Caden. Wait, did I freeze or did Caden freeze? Uh-oh. That's not ideal. Can other people hear me? We can't hear you, Caden. That's not ideal. Thank you. Okay, cool. We can hear me. That's exciting.
Oh, I forgot to unmute myself.
Aha, that would do the trick.
Aha.
Fire away.
Okay. Yeah. For the rise of the far left can lead to authoritarianism, so it would no longer be a liberal democracy.
How so?
Far leftism, I'm assuming you mean like socialism or communism, which isn't necessarily conducive to democracy.
Yeah, for sure. There's also what's it called? Where is it? There's this interesting theory that you can look up. It's called the horseshoe theory, which is this kind of interesting idea that the farther left or farther right you get, the increasingly close they start looking to each other. So kind of similar to that, the idea that relatively radical conceptions of advocacy can be that way. Anyone want to make a broader version of this argument? By which I mean, this seems to implicitly be an argument that's far leftism is just independently bad. Could you maybe make an independent argument that just like far leftism is bad? Yeah, Jeffrey.
This could lead to polarization on the other side, and I'm pretty sure everyone agrees that far rightism is bad.
Yeah, so maybe like increased support for the far right, for sure. We'll go Charles, and then we'll move on to Op for a second.
I mean, like sometimes far leftism like advocates for like armed revolution and stuff like that, specifically to like overthrow systems of power because they don't support like things like democracy and things like that because they think it's failing. So it could like horseshoe theory, like how a lot of far leftists support lax gun laws so that citizens can like carry guns and like maybe have a revolution in the future.
Okay, so maybe there's like bad conceptions of advocacy, for sure. Just for the sake of time, we'll move on just to Op, just so we have time to cover other things, but good ideas for sure. I think that probably the easiest argument to win this debate on is basically this argument, just that it's much harder to get policies passed in general that are leftist to the extent that you now, for example, portray Biden as a socialist because he's within the same camp as a person like Bernie, and stuff like that. Op arguments. Why might the rise of far leftism be? Also, I think that Emily put a thing in chat earlier, which is basically like or I think like stuff on funding, which is definitely true. Yeah, Overton window. You want to explain what that means, Jared?
Sure. So basically, if you're in support of the rise of far left politics, it will shift the conversation to make, even if those seem radical, maybe some more center left ideals would be more reasonable in comparison, and shifting the overall conversation into one that is overall leftist.
Yeah. Anyone know what's every debater's favorite classic example of the Overton window? Everyone loves to use this example. Anyone? I at least use this a lot. It's like the famous example that people like to cite of the Overton window. Yeah, Emily?
Is it the MLK one in Malcolm X?
Yeah. So a lot of people will basically cite Malcolm X as a figure whose more radical advocacies were good because they made a person like Martin Luther King, for instance, seem comparatively less radical and therefore more palatable. Other Op thoughts? I'm not sure if Caden, your hand is up from before. I'll assume so, unless you want to add something here on Op. Other thoughts on Op in general that folks want to add in? Jeffrey's had a hand from before, or still, or Op idea?
It's still raised, and I guess they could argue that like the third way has basically made center left parties like centrist or even like center right in a way, and that like there needs to be like a voice that represents the left, and only the far left can do so because the center left parties aren't going to become center left again.
Yeah. And maybe there's kind of an implicit argument you're almost making here, which is an extension of the Overton window argument, which is that the far right exists either way. So we sort of need some sort of counterbalancing force to kind of like balance political discourse out and so on and so forth in that sort of sense. Yes, you're right, Frank, basically. It's just different conceptions of approaching the same idea, basically. Yeah, Jared.
I mean, you can also just say something more generally about why far left politics are generally speaking good for most of the populace and like protecting rights and social policy and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I agree. Okay, cool. So yeah, Sophia, then we'll move on.
All right, I guess you can make an argument of the more radical people are going to get more done for the movement than the moderate people. So if you have radical leftists, they're going to fight more for leftist policies than moderate ones.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Okay, Adrian, and then we'll move on.
I just had a question, like, what would you define this house as in the motion? Like, would you define it as the Democratic Party so you don't have to make a case for leftism, like, independently?
Yeah, in American Party, you could certainly do that. I think if you wanted to be a little bit more generous, you could, as a gov team, it probably wouldn't be a horrible idea to define this house as society, since you can then make generic arguments about why far leftism is uniquely bad, is probably what I'd say. Okay, good work, crew, on far leftism and liberal democracies. Nice job. Okay, quick stuff on Republican Party, and then we'll move on. Few things to know about Republicans. In general, like obviously Republicans favor conservatism. Since 2016, Trump has become like notably powerful within the Democratic Party. He's energized a lot of anti-establishment rhetoric and has also become very, very good at selling narratives of misinformation in a way that means that he's captured a huge portion of the Republican Party. And that's why he's sort of transformed the Republican Party in a lot of very structural and political ways. This is a really, I think this is a fascinating ad. So this ad was run in 2020, admittedly, but it uses footage from before 2016. I'm going to play it because I think it's funny, and I think it shows you a little bit like just how crazily shifted the Republican Party has become. So fingers crossed.
Well, I want to talk to the Trump supporters.
Can you hear that, hopefully? Like, I just paused it, but could you hear it from before? Okay, cool, awesome. I'm just going to play this. I think this is a fascinating like example of what Trump's rise has done.
Well, I want to talk to the Trump supporters for a minute. What is Donald Trump's campaign about? He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. And you know how you make America great again? Tell Donald Trump to go to hell. If you can't admire Joe Biden as a person, then it's probably you got a problem. You need to do some self-evaluation. Because what's not to like? He is as good a man as God ever created. He said some of the most incredibly heartfelt things that anybody could ever say to me. He's the nicest person I think I've ever met in politics.
So this was, it was like a ad funded by a group of Republicans who are opposed to Trump. That's Lindsey Graham, for those of you who don't know who that is. Lindsey Graham is a Republican senator who has since fallen heavily into the Trump camp and is now full in on almost everything Trump says and does. So it's kind of an interesting example. That being said, there's obviously been pushback within the Republican establishment against Trump. So perhaps the most notable example of that is Mitt Romney, senator from Utah. There's a lot of reasons why people are opposed to Trump, even within Republicanism. But perhaps the best argument is just to take the argument that we made for why far leftism is bad and apply it in the inverse direction, which is that what Trump has also done is made the Republican Party a party of radicalism, at least relative to where it was even just probably 6, 8, 10 years ago. And there's been an extent to which a lot of moderates have been turned off from that type of rhetoric, which is why Biden was able to capitalize upon some of those voters and stuff like that. In terms of general trends, though, Republicans do tend to target groups like, for example, non-college diploma holding voters. They tend to dominate that group fairly well. And evangelical Christians in the South are one of the most consistent Republican sources of support, especially within relatively rural areas. Few quick political figures to know that are kind of good people to be aware of. Nancy Pelosi, one of the heads of the Democratic Party, Chuck Schumer as well. I'm sorry, Chuck Schumer, I cropped this image horribly. So it looks like his head is really horribly proportioned to his shoulders, but I promise he does look normal. Kevin McCarthy is the House Minority Leader. Ironic, but he's the Republican head basically in the House of Representatives. This here is Mitch McConnell. I did deliberately crop this one badly because, I mean, what a face. I mean, what a face, man. Look at that neck. What a sexy god right there. Joe Manchin. Oh, Joe Manchin. He's a Democrat. He could be called what's called a Dino, D-I-N-O, Democrat in name only, which basically means that functionally he is a Democrat, but like he's also like is he a Democrat? Like maybe not, because he's like very, very reluctant to pass a lot of policies. He's fairly explicitly pro-life. He is one of the singularly like largest headaches for the Democratic Party and consistently holds up a lot of legislation. You are thoroughly correct. He has an incredibly punchable face. The other person who has less of a punchable face, but is still a very polarizing figure within Democrat discourse is Kristen Sinema, who is kind of in a similar boat in terms of slightly more socially progressive compared to Manchin, but again, very, very reluctant in many instances to support a lot of the more hardline policies that more leftist / progressive figures within the Democratic establishment have pushed for. So these two people are almost always the people that you'll hear about in the news as kind of somewhat like whatever anti-Democrat thing. Oh no, to be clear, I agree with you, Caden. It's just that he's he caucuses with the Democrats, but then also like he's the reason why Democrats can't get stuff done. It's not independently bad. If you don't think that what Democrats do, for instance, is good. It just like from a Democrat perspective, he causes a lot of headaches for Biden and Pelosi and stuff. So normatively, you can make arguments as to why people like Manchin and Sinema is good. It's just that, I mean, I think that from an objective perspective, it's a punchable face. I mean, I think most people have punchable faces if they're in politics, but like from a Democratic perspective, they're like always like kind of struggling to like get around these two. So whenever you hear like Democrats trying to pass policy agenda XYZ, you almost always hear these two people's names come up. Okay, elections in debate. So that was like major party stuff. Before we chat about elections debate, general questions on stuff so far, or things that people want to ask about. Gorgeous. Okay. Oh wait, oops, I might have gotten the question. Yeah, Jacqueline.
So in a liberal democracy, or like a politics motion in general, like favoring a certain party, what are you supposed to define the House as?
Yeah, so that kind of actually like leads us nicely into this. So I think that in general, there's two types of instances where that would come up. There's one set of cases, and it's very rare that you'll get this, but sometimes you'll get motions that are like motions about what bad parties should do, or like kind of questionable actors should do. In that instance, you probably can make the debate a general debate about like what side is the most bad for that party. Like if you have a debate about like what like the far right should do, I know it's weird, but like unless the debate is from the perspective of the far right, you could be like, we want to decrease the power of the far right. How do we best do that? In 99% of debates, though, the general debate that you're having is what is best for society in general. And often you can make arguments as to why one party is better for society in general, which leads us nicely into how do you argue about elections in debate? This section is going to be pretty brief because I want to be able to get to courts and then talk about courts for a while. So I apologize if you're very connected to this topic, but I have videos on this that I've made, so you can watch them later. Question, folks, really simple. How do you win an election? Like, don't overthink it. How do you win an election? Yeah, you got it, Jared. You get votes. But obviously the question then becomes, how exactly do you get votes? So let's hear some ideas. Okay, Charles, get money. Yes, you're right. What else? How else do you get votes? Like, what are the other important things to do in order to get votes? Talk to voters, canvass. You need to get supporters on your side, campaigning, effective campaigning, get RADA to endorse you. Yes, of course. Support policies that people actually like, for sure. Invigorate your base. Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of things that you can arguably do to try to win an election. These are probably some of the obvious ones that come to mind. Getting money, getting talked about in the media, having advertisements out there, getting endorsements from major people within your party, having control over narrative, campaigning both effectively in positive and in negative ways, getting support within your own party, reaching out to voters. A lot of people forget about this clash and debate. Don't forget about it. It's not just enough to prove that voters like something. You also have to prove that you actually invigorate or energize voters enough that they actually care enough to turn out and vote. So oftentimes that's a crucial kind of sticking point. So this is kind of a general set of questions that I think can be useful to ask yourself on almost any politics motion, either whether you're debating from the perspective of like you as a politician or you as a party, but also normatively, like what type of candidate or what type of party do we want to have win election? How do we best ensure that party, gains the most amount of power, right? So I think that the easiest way to do this in lots of cases is basically every election motion ever implicitly is a debate about trade-offs. Unless there is some really, really bipartisan thing, almost all the time, if you have a motion that's like this house as a party would embrace X thing, there's some group of voters who likes it and some group of voters who dislikes it. And the question almost always then becomes, how can you demonstrate why the group of voters who support this is just a more important group than the group of voters who don't support this? My personal advice, make this weighing really clear as early as possible. So we'll do an example with this in a second, but if you have a motion about this house as the Democrats embrace X strategy, and you say this will get, moderates on board and maybe alienate progressives, just be super upfront from the first speech. Here is why, as the Democratic Party, you should care far more about getting moderates to buy in as opposed to progressives to buy in, and just be upfront with the weighing. You can obviously also think about other groups. So like, how do you get funding? How do you get other parties to, for example, support you? How do you get people within your campaign or your party or your community to support you? How do you get other people within the broader apparatus of the party to support you? These are just questions that you can try to ask yourself, either from the perspective of a candidate or if you're trying to prove a benefit to a candidate kind of in general, normatively speaking. So we're going to do a few examples of this. We'll probably do one of these, then there's a different motion I'm going to spring on you that I didn't tell you about in advance. So ha 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 ha. Cue evil laugh cackle in the back, which would be kind of fun. Okay, first quick motion that we're just going to chat about. We're just going to chat about one side on this, and then we'll chat a little bit of the Republican Party. This House is the Democrats would advocate for expanding the Supreme Court prior to the 2022, like during the midterm election season, basically advocate for expanding the court. I want us to think about a gov on this motion. So basically, we're not going to do all, we're just going to focus on advocacy for court packing. Okay, ideas for like, I don't even want us to focus immediately right now on like specific arguments. I just want to ask like one really basic question. Who likes this policy? And who dislikes this policy? And when I say this policy, I mean this advocacy. I don't literally, I kind of mean court packing, but I more so mean the idea of advocating for court packing. Yeah, Caden.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess whoever has the minority in the court at the time.
Yeah.
Like right now, it's definitely the Democrats, but I don't think that would be true if they had the 6-3 majority, and it looked like that was going to be consistent for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. If we just zero in for a second, though, if we literally just think about the 2022 midterms, you're right. That would basically mean Democrats. But even within this group of Democrats, presumably Republicans will hate you anyway. If we zero in on this group of Democrats, right? In other words, like people who the Democratic Party is trying to get, to support them, basically, what most likely, or like who most likely within the Democratic Party is going to feel good or like the idea of kind of maybe eschewing traditional democratic norms and adding justices to the court? What type of Democratic voter wants that? Oh, oops, I have hand raises. Ryan, open your hand raises. Let's go, Charles.
I mean, people who feel like the Supreme Court needs to like has some influence over their rights. Like, I mean, like women, LGBTQ plus people in marriages, people of color, like stuff like that.
Sure. Can we generalize that a bit? Can we come up with like a perhaps all-encompassing or like, like perhaps like I kind of used this phraseology before, but like, is there like a kind of like easy group that we could point to? Yeah, Jeffrey.
Progressives?
Yeah. So TLDR, the people who are going to like this policy are kind of like hardline leftists within the Democratic Party. These are the people who have been advocating for this, calling for this for a while, right? Those are the people who are totally willing to do something that's fairly, at least within contemporary history, unprecedented. They're the ones who are willing to get on board with this, right? And we can think about structural reasons for why they're going to like this policy, right? There's probably an extent to which, a lot of progressives kind of feel disenthused with kind of, moderate centrism. There's a lot of people who kind of feel discouraged by this term Supreme Court, blah, blah, blah. Who's going to dislike this party within the general? I mean, obviously everyone's going to be like, oh, Republicans will dislike this. But presumably, if we did as the Democratic Party, this House would advocate for insert almost anything. It's going to be difficult to get like real hardline Republicans on board. So more so within the group of Democrats, like I forget who mentioned it earlier, but within the general realm of Democrats, what's the flip? If progressives like this, then who's going to dislike this? Just kind of big picture. Yeah, moderates. So presumably the group of Democratic voters who are somewhat opposed to this are kind of moderates within the Democratic Party. So centrists, maybe former independent voters, maybe people who kind of are, former Republicans who've kind of turned to democratism since the rise of Trump, whatever. So TLDR, like there's a lot of stuff that can come up in this debate, but almost certainly at the end of the round, the central clash you'll end up getting is basically a clash on, as the Democrats, who should you care more about? Should you care more about progressives or should you care more about moderates? That's basically the debate, more or less. So if you can spend time in prep trying to come up with reasons why you as the Democratic Party should care more about the kind of smaller group of progressives or the broader group of moderates, that's probably a really helpful thing to do when it comes to approaching a motion like this. We'll just spend a quick second on this and then move on. Anyone want to give a generic reason why maybe it's better? I think I forget, someone earlier mentioned this. I think Sophie, you did, but what's a generic reason why maybe it's better to focus on getting progressives into your movement to support your party as opposed to moderates? Yeah, you're 100% right, Julianne. You're going to get progressives on board. Oh yeah, all good. Finish typing out, and then we can reconsider. Why would we care more about that? Yeah, Sophie.
Well, I yes, I did say this before, but you can always argue that progressives are going to do more for the movement than moderates because, I mean, number one, they just care more about getting those policies. I mean, not progressive, sorry. The more radical people are going to do more than the moderate people because they care more about the policies, more important to them, are going to push harder, going to fight more for the movement. So it just means you're going to get more done.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe if we can energize this portion of the Democratic base, that's the more important group to cater to. They're going to get more done, and it's going to be on net, perhaps just more substantially important. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, do other folks want to come up with other reasons why we should care more about progressives? I'm just curious if anyone has any burning thoughts. Yeah, David.
Presumably, moderates' advocacy can help shift the Overton window and lead to more support for more progressive or left-leaning policies.
Yeah, so maybe we can say this makes it easier to justify other policies, right? Yeah, Emily. You're 100% right, David. Yeah.
Okay, maybe if you say that like these groups we care about them more because like they've been more marginalized in the past and their issues are kind of at the forefront of like what the court is dealing with, and advocate that it's more moral. I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe we can make an implicitly kind of moral type argument and say these are the groups that we should have the greatest moral duty to. Yeah, for sure. Jared.
Okay, this is kind of weird, but you could say that even if people don't end up liking progressives, like in the moderate versus progressive class, if you have them in office, even if people don't like them, because of some policy, they usually work in a way that benefits the majority of people, i.e., like for instance, economically helping the majority while advocating against the top 1% or stuff like that. So even if people don't necessarily like them in terms of their political views, they will still do what's sort of best for those groups.
Yeah, so maybe we can make
It's kind of weird. But...
Yeah, no, I like it. So it's actually kind of implicitly another argument about here's why this is just better for Democratic voters. I'll just add kind of like two other things in terms of why else might you want to prioritize progressives. For one thing, you can make an argument, this is just literally just a weighing argument, which is that do progressives tend to be young or old? Yeah, you got it, Emily. They tend to be young. And that means that they, tend to be young, which basically means what? It means they're the future voter base that you need to cater to. These are the people that are like, bluntly, 70-year-olds ain't going to live around forever. They're going to die. These are the more important people to consider for the longevity of your party. Other thing that you can say, it might be true that moderates dislike this. The question is, do moderates dislike this specific advocacy enough to stop voting for Democrats, right? And the kind of interesting weighing I think you could go for on a class like this on Gov is basically to say that this advocacy is uniquely important for energizing progressives because this is a key central voting issue for a huge number of progressives. Maybe not this specific thing, but things like, re-establishing the precedent of Roe versus Wade, empowering the EPA to be able to implement environmental rules, but also the signaling effect of this motion, just the idea that Democrats are willing to like put it out all on the line or willing to play a little bit dirty or are willing to kind of do the things that are necessary to get shit done. This is uniquely important for energizing progressives. There might be an argument that says moderates might not abandon their support of Democrats for this. Because if you're a moderate, you're still scared of Trump, you're still scared of the rise of conservatives. And honestly, maybe it's the case that you dislike this policy, but you probably will continue voting for Democrats for all the reasons you always voted for Democrats, insofar as you care about things like, say, better education policy, better healthcare planning, whatever. But we know that under status quo, a huge number of progressives aren't voting. So a continuation of the status quo for that group is much more politically detrimental to the Democrats, just as kind of some ideas. I'm going to skip over this motion, although it's a kind of fun motion to prep. So I think it'd be kind of fun to prep. The other, I'm just going to skip to a little bit more of a normative motion and have a motion that says this. This House supports, I'll say this. This House believes that it is in the, I'll word it like this. This House supports the formation of feminist political parties. So here it's a little bit different because we're not arguing per se directly from the interest of a political organization or political party. But let's say that we're gov on this motion. Just using like some of the main concepts from before in terms of like, how do we get, for example, in this context, feminist political change? Let's come up with like some generic, you know what, I'm bored of gov. Let's talk about op. What are some generic op arguments you might make on a motion like this? If we're talking about winning elections, so on and so forth. If anyone has like thoughts or ideas. Yeah, Jeffrey.
It'll lead to vote splitting and lead the Republicans into office who are more anti-feminist than the Democrats.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the first past the post argument from before. Basically, if you end up having liberals who vote, feminists now, that basically, takes away votes from sort of center left parties and therefore sort of implicitly advantages conservatives for sure. Let me check chat. Less likely to get voted for sure. So maybe we can just make a kind of corollary to this argument that these parties aren't very likely to even win in the first place. So, we can give reasons for that. And then maybe, the kind of strategic sort of implication of this is basically if these parties aren't likely to win, but they do splinter leftist coalitions, the implication ends up being these parties don't win, other bad parties do win, things end up becoming worse as a consequence. Yeah, Sophie.
I guess you could also say it harms the feminist movement in and of itself because the feminists, like what it means to be a feminist looks very different to a lot of people. And in order to be a political party, you have to have a very strict set of rules, what it means. And now you're saying if your view of feminism doesn't fit into what our party stands for, then your feminism isn't right, which obviously is just going to make the movement in itself less impactful. You can probably go more into that about how that's going to harm their incentives. And I guess like when you go into politics, it becomes about getting votes and not about like what's actually doing the best for the feminist movement. So overall, it can just harm the movement.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing I'd add to that, right, as a kind of an extension of that is like now, like elections are determined on lots of non-feminist issues. If you're a feminist political party, you don't have to have in your party platform stances on like GMOs or like taxes or like shit that has nothing to do with feminism. And even if you can like connect it to feminism, it still probably is to some extent sketchy. And that means that you have people who otherwise would have supported feminists who now view this party as the mainstream conception of feminism and get turned off. Luca and then Emily.
This is sort of similar to Sophie's, but in order to be like a viable political party and to like appeal to more voters, you have to like shift more towards the center. And this oftentimes like takes away from the feminist movement. Like it takes away from some of the slightly more radical or slightly more less popular necessary agenda.
Yeah, for sure. So you need to like water down your advocacy, and the type of advocacy you end up getting is worse for sure. Emily.
Sophie and Luca basically said what I was going to say, but I'd also add something about this perhaps encouraging the development of radical feminism and turfism, and how that might, I guess, make the feminist movement in general lose face.
Yeah, so maybe we say that there's also a flip side of the same argument, which is even if you don't become very, very moderate, you alternatively become very radical. Either way is bad. Either you water down messaging and dilute the power of feminist safe spaces, or you actively go very, very radical, and now you sort of perceptualize the entire movement as being very fringe, etc. That's awesome. So see, like what's nice about this case is that you have multiple paths to victory. You have a path to victory on politics, probably a lot of good defense, and you also have independent offense on feminism. Very good job, crew. Excellent, excellent. Okay, we're going to skip on ahead to courts. This is going to be the last thing we cover tonight, and then I think so. Wait, oh, yeah, courts and criminal justice, which are quite similar. And then we're going to do Kahoot after that. So we'll probably have about 25 more minutes or so with this, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, courts. There's a lot of text on the following slides. I apologize. I was like writing these notes, and I like got really into it, and I was like just chug, chug, chug. So I apologize if these are a bit dense, but it'll be fine. So what are courts? The two branches of government we've chatted about the most so far are executive and legislative branches, which are basically responsible for creating and enforcing laws. Courts are responsible for a very strictly anti-majoritarian purpose, which means the goal of a court is not necessarily to do what is popular, not necessarily to do what is believed by people to be good. It is to apply the law in a non-political and relatively impartial way. Now, to be clear, the fact that courts are intended to do that doesn't mean they always do that. We'll chat about that in a second. The way that most court systems function is that judges have at least some degree of power in different ways, which we'll try about in a second. Most judges, at least at the federal or relatively high power level, tend to be nominated, like, for example, by a president in the United States, and are subsequently confirmed by a different branch of the government, say, for example, Congress. In some contexts, some judges will be like elected. This happens in some local states, for example. You can make all the generic arguments in those debates about why elections are good or why elections are bad. So, for example, one of the common issues that maybe comes up in like elections is whether or not you vote for actually good candidates, or you just vote for the candidate who sounds the best or has the most money, like we've chatted about before. The United States is an instance where, and most other countries have this as well, but the US is a very good example of this. Courts have the power of what's called judicial review. What that basically means is if legislative bodies pass laws, courts have the legal jurisdiction to strike down those laws if those laws are deemed to be in violation of the Constitution. Interestingly, this is not a power that is explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, in the sense that there is no explicit clause of the Constitution that outright comes out and says the Supreme Court will have the power to strike down laws. It's ironically a power the Supreme Court gave to itself in Marbury versus Madison. It's a very funny case. You should read it if you haven't read it. I find it hysterical. But what this basically means is that courts have a lot of implicit power in the sense that they can strike down laws, but more important than that, they also interpret laws, which then affects two things. One, it affects the priorities of lawmakers, because lawmakers know that the laws they pass have to be in line with the current interpretation of the clauses or components of constitutions, which are most directly relevant in the context of the law they passed. The second other thing that happens is that lower level courts are bound by the decisions issued by higher level courts. So, for example, just easy instance of this, if in the United States, the Supreme Court, which is the highest level court, rules that school segregation is not allowed, a lower level court is bound to uphold that case. So that lower level court can't be like, no, actually, we think school segregation is legally fine and we can't break it up. So this is known as basically just the idea of like presidentialism, the concept that basically higher courts issue rulings, lower courts are bound to those rulings. Stare decisis. I'm sorry, I'm horrible with Latin. I spoke it, but I took it in Latin, but it's weird. So there are a few different like types of courts I'll quickly blitz through. Federal versus state courts. Basically, just the difference in this is that federal courts deal with federal law, state courts deal with state law. That's basically the main / most important distinction. The Supreme Court can interestingly hear cases from either the federal court system or the state court system. And it also has what's called original jurisdiction, which means if the Supreme Court wants to just pick a case to hear for the first time, it can do that. The Supreme Court gets somewhere around 7,000 annual appeals, basically cases that more or less attorneys want the Supreme Court to hear. The Supreme Court ends up taking about 100 of those. So it's like getting into the law school, or it's like getting into an Ivy, but like law edition, because now you're like trying to get your case to be heard by the Supreme Court. The second kind of split within the court system involves civil versus criminal law. The long story short difference is that civil law generally tends to deal with disputes between individuals. So like whatever you like, whatever, want to divorce me. I'm not sure why I said you generically, but yeah, you want to divorce me, or like contract disputes. But also things like, for example, like discrimination, harassment, stuff like that also qualifies as a form of civil law, defamation as well. Criminal courts tend to deal with things that involve a greater degree of physical or moral threat, either to individuals directly or society in general. And there's a couple of structural but important differences between civil and criminal court cases. The first difference, I didn't list this here, but in civil cases, the burden of proof on the prosecution or the plaintiff is much lower. So in the civil court, in a civil court, the plaintiff only has to show basically that the defendant is guilty, sort of on a balance of probabilities. So basically, we are more sure than not that the person that we're accusing of committing a crime actually committed the crime. Conversely, in criminal cases, the standard is very strict. We have to be sure that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Excuse me. And what that means in practice is that it is harder to get a conviction, at least theoretically, in criminal courts compared to civil courts. There's also structural differences in phraseology. In civil courts, the person who's suing is called the plaintiff, and the person they're suing is called the defendant. In criminal, by the way, technically they're not called the defendant, they're called the respondent, but no one calls it the respondent, at least in debate. So you can call it defendant and be fine. And in criminal court cases, the person suing is called the prosecutor and the person being sued is called the defendant. Importantly, though, in civil court cases, the person who was actually wronged sues. So for example, if like Jared slanders me for my horrible memes and I want to sue Jared because I'm like, no, that's defamation, Jared, I would basically go to a court and I would launch a lawsuit against Jared. In the context of criminal wrongs, individual people who are wronged are not the ones that launch prosecutions. The state is the one that launches prosecutions. So in other words, the state has jurisdiction over like pressing charges and stuff like that. For a while, I was like, why do they do that? And the very weird philosophical reason is that in theory, and we'll chat about this in a second, criminal wrongs implicate society in a way, in the sense that other people are afraid that they're going to be murdered, or other people feel a sort of sense of disturbance when criminal wrongs happen. There's also another really stupid reason. Anyone want to guess what a really stupid reason is why we don't give individual victims the power to sue in criminal cases? Like really stupid. Think of like the classic criminal wrong. This one, murder.
They might be dead.
dead.
They're fucking dead. They can't sue. Yeah, if you're like a person who got killed, then you just can't sue, so the state does it. The last type of distinction within the court system is trial versus appellate courts. Trial courts are the first courts you go to. They listen to the facts of the case, they rule on whether you're guilty or innocent, and then sentence you. Appellate courts are where you appeal decisions that you disagreed with. In most instances, only defendants can appeal. Generally, prosecutors can't. And what that basically means is that appellate courts are where you review the trial and basically look at whether or not that trial was wrong in some way, or misapplied the facts or misapplied precedent. And appellate courts can then review and overturn or modify decisions issued by lower level courts. As you go up and up and up the legal system, the higher level a court is, the more powerful they are, in the sense that once they issue a ruling, the precedent they establish is binding on all lower level courts. Unless you have a civil law system. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because it's not superly duperly important, but most debates take place in 3 countries. The United States, well, like our like silly debate game thing, take place in the United States, Canada, or Britain. Those are where most debate schools exist or whatever. Also Australia and like lots of other places, and also the Philippines. They're fucking good at debate. But anyways, the gist is most of those countries use a system of common law, which is the system of law that Canada and the US both use. There's also a entirely different legal structure. It's called civil law. In civil law, this whole idea of precedentialism, like the higher court issues a ruling and then lower courts are bound, is not anywhere near as important. What basically instead happens more or less is that instead of laws being written in kind of vague ways, laws generally tend to be written in the form of what's called statutory law. They tend to be much more specific. And instead of courts looking at precedent when figuring out how to rule, they look almost exclusively at the text of the law. And they literally just say, like, what does the law actually support? And they basically apply the law in that way. So it's kind of weird because in the civil law system, judges take on a much more active role during the trial itself. But when it actually comes to issuing a decision, they're much more bound by the text of the law as opposed to the guidance of past legal cases. You can read up about the history. The long story short is that common law emerged out of Britain, where basically in like the 15 and 1600s, Britain would basically, like, the king would kind of just like more or less just like kind of issue these writs, which basically were more or less laws. But like more or less if someone broke those writs or those laws, courts would be like, what the fuck we supposed to do? Because it would be like a scrap of paper that the king would be like, this is a law. So the way that courts emerged within England was generally to consider how past courts had dealt with similar sorts of issues. This is generally what's called case law, where you basically look at the past series of legal cases that have been presented to courts. You basically look at those past precedents and then make a decision. The Roman Empire is where most of the civil law system emerged. So under a lot of Roman emperors, they basically over time developed a very like authoritative set of laws that was very, very specific, such that basically whenever you sued someone for violating those laws, judges would almost exclusively just look at the text of the law when determining how to rule, so on and so forth. US Supreme Court, few quick things on it. 9 justices, they like to wear Jedi robes. They are appointed for life terms, as are all federal judges, and they have a lot of power. The current Supreme Court even if you're conservative, you can kind of agree that the Supreme Court went like, wow, off the deep end. Like objectively one of the most like crazy Supreme Court terms, at least in recent memory. The most substantial ruling of which we'll cover in a second was a case that overturned the 1973 Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case, which I don't think any high school tournament will set a motion on it. Any American high school tournament, I don't think will set a motion on it because #angryparents. I would expect a college tournament at some point to set a really crazy motion on it. That'll be like, this house believes X really radical measures should be taken in response, like women should jointly go on strike. Or I think that motion will be set at some point, but that's just a personal guess. It's not actually a real thing, just a guess. A few major Supreme Court cases that are cool to know. Marbury versus Madison established the precedent of judicial review. 1819 basically is a Supreme Court case that basically more or less asked whether or not Congress had the constitutional authority to establish a national bank. The actual details of the case are #unimportant, but the important thing that came of this court case was basically that the federal government has supreme authority over state governments. And in instances where federal law conflicts with state law, federal law wins out. Skipping ahead a wee little bit, 1954 Brown versus Board. This is another case that comes up a bunch. It's everyone's favorite classic example of basically like, maybe not judicial activism, because this is very much supported by the 14th Amendment, but basically you banned school segregation. 1965 Griswold v. Connecticut is the first Supreme Court case to establish a constitutional sort of protected claim towards access to contraception. Subsequently, in 1967, Loving v. Virginia establishes legal protection against laws that bar interracial marriage. 1973, Roe versus Wade establishes abortion protections in the United States. 2010, we mentioned this earlier, Citizens United basically deals with campaign finance reforms. 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges legalizes gay marriage in the United States. And then subsequently, this past June 2022, Dobbs versus Jackson overturns the Supreme Court case on Roe versus Wade, and therefore defers back to state governments when making abortion laws, so on and so forth. Wait, did I, Ryan? There's a small chance I wrote a Kahoot question about that, so I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what I was about to tell you because it might be on the Kahoot. If it's not on the Kahoot, I'll tell you afterwards. Okay, so that's kind of the boring part of courts. I want to talk about the more interesting part of courts for a second, which basically more or less is just inequality within the judicial system, and then we'll talk about the four main pillars of legal philosophy. So there's four main brands of inequality I'm going to chat about within the judicial system. The first is basically the public attorney system. This is something that I actually think is quite intuitive, so we'll chat about this very quickly, but long story short, in most countries, the United States included, there is a public defense system, which means that if you are too poor to afford private legal defense, the state will assign you a lawyer. The problem is overwhelmingly, these defendants tend to be structurally overworked. So for example, it's not uncommon for public defenders to have about 90 seconds per case. Like, think about that. Y'all want to write a debate case in 90 seconds, let alone like come up with a legal defense or like talk with the prosecutor for 90 seconds? I don't think so. And they often are also quite frequently under-resourced. That means compensation is low, turnover rates are high, are quite high, and it often means that the quality of legal defense that literally can be provided is quite low. The other, and I'm going to talk about plea bar. Wait, do I have it? I think I have a thing on plea bargains. I'm just going to say it now because this is a big opinion I have. Plea bargaining is such a clean type of argument to frame around in debate. What do I mean by that? Almost every debate that you'll ever have about court systems, almost all of the arguments that will ever be made are about trials. About 95%, at least in the United States, of criminal cases never get to trial because they end in plea bargains. That's basically when a prosecutor comes to a person who's accused of a crime and says, hey, instead of going through the whole trial process, why don't you just agree to say that you're guilty, maybe even if you're not, and just accept a shorter sentence? The vast bulk of criminal cases end in a plea bargain. So it's a super, if you can ever find a really cool argument how we make, for example, plea bargains fairer, or we decrease plea bargaining, it's a fantastically cool argument to frame around. It's just my personal advice to you guys. So every time you ever get a criminal justice motion, like ask yourself if there's something on plea bargaining, because it's a really cool argument to frame around. But the other reason why this whole overburdened public defense system matters is because it often forces attorneys to be substantially more willing to accept plea bargain deals with their clients, because you literally just don't have the time to fight those cases. And even if you did at the time, it comes at the direct opportunity cost of working on some other case. Second series of inequalities are based around laws and enforcement of laws. There's a lot of reasons why, just very structurally, the laws that police enforce are themselves often quite racist. Legislatures, like legislative bodies, often are very rich and very white. Just look at the US Congress as a good example of that. And even if that wasn't the case, there's often a structural underrepresentation of minorities within politics, especially because a lot of marginalized groups either A, face legal barriers to voting, or, and I should say, B, in lots of instances, the legacies of distrust that exist within those communities make those communities statistically less likely to turn out and vote in many instances, as well as there's things like gerrymandering, et cetera, which means in totality that lawmakers often want to look tough on crime. They often want to pass measures that, even if they're not explicitly racist, de facto enforce structures of white supremacy or like racism, et cetera. And just beyond that, there's a lot of other ways that the system of lawmaking often ends up being quite discriminatory. The prison industrial complex, for example, is massive. Something like 1 in 5, like 1 out of every 5 like desk chairs in the United States was made in or using labor involved in prisons. So like there's a massive industry just built around using prisoners for labor, and therefore there's a lot of commercial profit incentives to ensure that there's a lot of people staying for long periods of time in prisons. Beyond the fact that laws themselves are often quite bad, there's obviously enormously racist disparities in policing. We'll talk, I think next week actually, about like specific reasons why it's very difficult to hold police accountable for the messed up things they do, things like qualified immunity, police unions, so on and so forth. But long story short, there's a huge extent to which in many instances just the communities that are structurally over-policed are ones that are largely resided in by marginalized groups. So for example, empirically speaking, cocaine usage by white and Black Americans is statistically almost identical, but like the vast bulk of individuals who are convicted for possessing or distributing cocaine tend to be Black individuals. Third form of inequality is basically just on the kind of like process of selecting juries. So most criminal trials are called jury trials. You can also have bench trials, which is basically when instead of having a jury determine whether or not you're guilty, you would have a judge do the same exact thing. The main gist, though, is that juries are supposed to just determine guilt or innocence. And more importantly, they're supposed to not be biased. Problem, they often are. And in some instances, the bias is kind of innocuous. Like, yeah, it probably isn't a good thing that jurors go on social media or talk to people outside of the courtroom. But like, it happens. But the more pernicious form of bias comes in the way that jurors are selected. So this is a really stupid argument, but it's true. And it can often be quite persuasive. Anyone know roughly, we'll just use the example of like racism in the United States as an example here. Does anyone know roughly what percentage of America is Black, roughly percentage-wise? Yeah, it's roughly 13%, roughly. So the way that the process of selecting jurors works is basically that attorneys from each side get 2 what are basically called discretionary strikes. They get to strike 2 potential jurors without having to give a reason for it. This is a really trivial question, but just statistically think about it. If 13% of the overall population is Black, and you bring in a pool of potential jurors, and let's say, you narrow it down to, let's say, 17 possible jurors, something like that. If you are, say, a prosecution and you don't want to have Black jurors on your jury, statistically, of the randomly selected people that you brought in for jury duty, roughly what percentage of them in general would you expect to be Black? Like, it's the same answer. It's the same answer. Like roughly somewhere in the ballpark of like you would expect probably to have 13-ish% of them be Black, or somewhere in that ball. And again, you could like, this is just a generic argument about racist disparities. But the idea is if you're a prosecution team and you use your 2, discretionary strikes to strike the 1 or 2 Black people that could potentially serve on the jury, if you use your 1 or 2 strikes on white people, it don't matter. There's still going to be a white majority on the jury. If you use it against a Black individual, you're maybe taking away the only source of potential racial, diversity on a potential jury. And what that means, especially in southern states, juries tend to be disproportionately white. And that often means they tend to be disproportionately more likely to convict, especially innocent individuals, simply on the basis of race-based politics, et cetera. Fourth form of inequality, there's a lot of really good resources out there I'd more than encourage you to read about in terms of cash bail in the system. Yeah, don't worry, I got you, mean Emily. You're all good. But like the kind of main gist of this that I'll kind of quickly flag is the US. Oh, wait, I don't think I added this question. I'm not, okay, fine. You can all look it up because I just made a big deal out of it. The US and the Philippines, I think, are the only two, I think it's the Philippines, yeah, are the only two countries that have a for-profit bail system. What that basically means is that when you go to jail before your trial, you basically can post bail. The amount of money that you have to pay to post bail is determined by judges, but it's really basically determined by prosecutors. Prosecutors tend to recommend high amounts of bail. Judges tend to set that. Judges and prosecutors alike are afraid of the bad optics that would come from setting a low amount of bail and then letting a potentially dangerous person back out onto the streets and then they recommit a crime, because that would be horribly ruinous for their political career. What that means is that lots of low-income individuals are arrested for offenses, even when they're innocent. They then have to pay a huge amount of money to get out of jail before their trial. They don't have the money. So what they do is they go to for-profit companies called bail bondsmen, who basically give them the temporary amount of money they need to post bail, but only do so for profit. So they charge interest on it. And the obvious problem that creates then is that basically you as a poor individual are in a catch-22. Either you stay in jail, which is bad, it means you're kept away from your family, you can't work, etc., or you go into massive amounts of debt just to get out of jail, to then go into a court system that is still pretty racist and still pretty classist. So the kind of disparities in terms of cash bail are often discussed in terms of like, A, whether or not it's morally fair to lock people up in jails before we've even tried them. And also secondarily, it often results in socioeconomically discriminatory outcomes. Okay, so those are some like big picture issues with the criminal justice system. A quick piece of advice is that it's often very effective in debate rounds to like ask yourself the question of basically, like it can be very helpful to ask yourself the question of what are the problems in the justice system? How do we potentially go about making them better? Any questions on like that kind of justice system-y stuff that folks want to ask? Wow, we're all experts. Okay, last section on Kahoot. Okay, criminal justice. This is pretty dense. I've written a lot of notes on this, so feel free to consult these afterwards. So philosophers are horribly divided over the issue of like what the best way of running a justice system is. And there's lots of different metrics that we can use. I'm going to focus on the four biggest ones that exist within judicial philosophy and especially within debate, and kind of talk about how they factor in and how they kind of play out and stuff and stuff like that. Don't worry, we're going to spend a full week on philosophy later. It'll be lots of fun. Broadly speaking, though, in almost any debate about criminal justice, there's broadly three groups of stakeholders that get discussed. Victims are basically people that have either already been the victim of a crime or could potentially be the victim of a crime that hasn't yet occurred, that we can hopefully try to stop that crime from happening. You can often make very persuasive arguments about why victims ought to have a central role within the process of administering and discharging justice, not only because of their proximity to criminal cases, but also because the process of trial is very, very debilitating and autonomy minimizing for victims. What do I mean? In civil cases, if you're the victim of some sort of wrong, you get almost full control over the process. You get to determine, what charges you're bringing forth, when you bring forth those charges, if you bring them forth at all. You have a lot of influence over how that plaintiff process plays out. In criminal wrongs, you have almost no influence. The state acts as the prosecutor. You're often subpoenaed to give things like witness testimony. Your name is often dragged through the mud. There's a huge degree of scrutiny that's placed upon you by prosecution, by defense, by the local media. Your name gets destroyed, etc. And therefore, there are very specific duties owed to victims by the justice system. You can also, of course, think about how criminals are affected by, motions about criminal justice. Obviously, criminals are criminals, but A, some of them are innocent. Even if we deem them to be criminal, they might actually still be underlyingly innocent. And second, the fact that an individual is a criminal, i.e. they did some criminal wrong, A, does not mean they forfeit their rights to just basic human dignity. And also B, with the exception of death penalty cases or life without the possibility of parole cases, most people sentenced to prison will at some point leave prison. And at which point in time we care about them, for example, being able to reintegrate in society and be able to coexist with other people to the extent that we want to protect society writ large. And of course, that also means that society is implicated by crime. And obviously that means that like people like family members and people like, witnesses, but also just the average person in society is in some way implicitly affected by crime. as I'll chat about in a second. So given that there's a lot of people that get affected by criminal justice debates, the question becomes, how do you weigh different stakeholders against each other? And kind of big picture, there's 4 big metrics that tend to come up. 2 of them are really important, 2 of them are really connected, and 1 of them is not as important because it's very self-intuitive and self-explanatory. The first core principle of the CJS means criminal justice system, by the way, BGW. The gist of retribution is basically we should punish people for doing bad things, regardless of whether that actually results in good or bad outcomes for society. So the notion of retribution, especially if you look at historical judicial literature, is very grounded in notions of vengeance and revenge. And that sounds harsh, but at the end of the day, it's actually a very simple concept. When someone breaks the terms that we as a society all agree to, they should face some degree of penalization for what they've done. And to be clear, it's often very easy to assume that retribution must mean punishment, and if we didn't have retribution, we wouldn't have any punishment. That's not entirely true. Retribution is the idea that we should specifically be punishing you extra or punishing you in notably harsh ways, specifically because what you did was wrong and a crime, and therefore we should just punish you for punishment's sake. Like, there's other metrics under which you can justify, say, locking a person away in prison. The point of retribution is to lock them away for extra long periods of time, to apply extra harsh sentences to them, so on and so forth. It's very easy, I think, in lots of instances, especially in like liberal debate land, to make arguments against retribution. If you ever want to make arguments for a fairly more retributively inclined justice system, these are some of the kind of common ones. Deterrence, we'll chat about in a second. Vigilante violence is basically the idea that when people in society, like even if we as like noble debaters don't think that vengeance is a good metric to base punishments on, that doesn't mean that people in the real world don't place value on things like revenge. And so in cases where society feels like the justice system has done an insufficient job of punishing someone, there often might be a push for individual people to take justice or matters into their own hands and stuff like that. Reporting of crime is a weird argument, but it's one of the, I think, most interesting arguments you could run in lots of debates on retribution. Like I mentioned before, reporting a crime and going through the entire subsequent process of prosecuting crime is very traumatizing for people. And in many instances, there's an interesting argument you can make that if people don't feel like the end outcome of a criminal trial is going to be sufficiently retributive, maybe it's just not worth the huge hassle of going through that entire process of potentially losing your job, having your reputation get destroyed. If you're not going to get a really cathartic outcome, i.e. a harsh sentence, maybe you just don't go through it at all. And in that instance, obviously the outcome of not reporting crime at all is terrible. People get off the hook, they never get prosecuted at all. The police don't even know they committed a crime because no one reported it. You can also make other arguments about like higher levels of policing and victim catharsis and so on, but feel free to read those on your own terms. Also, there's a good question in chat, which is like, to what extent are, for example, court fines in proportion to wealth? In most contexts, they aren't in proportion to wealth, at least under status quo. Some countries have systems that make fines proportional to wealth. The kind of obvious arguments you can make for why it's good to make fines proportional to wealth is just that if you do not make fines proportional to the amount of money that someone has, it disproportionately harms the poor, at which point in time you are technically violating the principle of equal punishment. So we generally say that people should get the same punishment for the same crime. In instances where you overly punish one person relative to another, there's an interesting argument that constitutes a relatively unusual or cruel form of punishment. It's unconstitutional, but just more generally immoral. The other question is like, to what extent is like plea bargaining proportional to wealth? In general, on average, poorer individuals are statistically more likely to enter into plea bargains. And the kind of intuitive reason behind that is basically that the richer you are, the better your legal defense is, which means the better your odds are of actually being able to win a court case. The other thing on top of that, though, is that plea bargaining is very often based on like kind of like fear of being treated unfairly. So, for example, the reason why lots of innocent people will accept plea bargains is because it's really scary to be told that you're going to have a public defendant or a public defender who has very little time to represent you. And if they lose, you could get sentenced to jail for 40 years. And the idea of being offered a plea bargain where instead of, you know, having the potentiality of going to jail for 40 years, you go to prison for 15 instead. Maybe it's true that you're innocent and you had some shot of getting acquitted, but you're kind of more risk averse compared to a richer person who knows they've got a better shot of being acquitted. Okay, this is a very generic picture. I'm sorry. Anyone know what this country is? This is a kind of classic example of a country that has a very retributive and very harsh justice system. And it's generally cited as one of the kind of common examples of where retribution works. Anyone want to guess what this country is? I know it's very generic looking. which I apologize for. Yeah, David, you got it. Singapore. Singapore is the kind of classic, like everyone's favorite example of aha, like rah rah, harsh sentences work. Okay, rehabilitation, kind of second main principle of criminal justice. So the idea of rehabilitation is people commit crimes for reasons, fix the reasons they don't commit crime again. There's lots of reasons why people might be more inclined to commit crime. It's seldom the case that any one factor like exclusively causes people to commit crime in an explicitly coercive way, but there are certain environmental factors or cues which can make individuals more likely to commit crime, not because they're innately criminal human beings or even because they're evil. It's rather because there are structural factors beyond someone's control that just very statistically make someone more likely to be forced into crime. Socioeconomic deprivation, lack of access to things like mental health or addiction services, also just having a relatively troubled background that makes it difficult for you to have access to support structures. The idea behind rehabilitation is focus on the reasons people commit crime, both people who have already committed crime, but also putting in place societal structures, like, for example, investing into education that make it less likely that those underlying causes of crime grow out of control in a way that makes people more inclined to turn into a life of crime, et cetera. In terms of the morality of rehabilitation, there's also some kind of interesting arguments that I'll quickly chat about here in terms of why arguably a rehabilitative justice system is more principally correct. The kind of most interesting argument I think you can make is basically that, in general, rehabilitative justice systems place a very heavy emphasis upon like healing, upon retraining, giving you the sort of support structures you need to get back up on your feet, which often means as a consequence that you spend less time in prison, for example, and more time doing things like community service, drug rehab, et cetera. There's kind of a few interesting moral reasons why that's correct. One of the arguments that I think is kind of interesting is that people change over time. Like physiologically, I think it's like every so months your entire body like replaces your cells. But at a more like moral / philosophical level, your preferences, thoughts, opinions, just physiology and psychology change over time. So whenever you sentence people to very harsh sentences, you're implicitly sentencing a different person by the end of that penalty period compared to when you first sentenced them. There's also another interesting argument that you can make, which is that if I put a gun to someone's head and say, do a crime, we generally say that that person should be held to a much lower degree of punishment because they were explicitly coerced into doing that crime, right? The logical corollary of that, to some extent, is that in general, we might arguably say that if there are environmental factors that make you more inclined to fall into the sort of crime trap, then perhaps you're less morally culpable for the wrong that you committed. And therefore, there's a greater degree to which we should minimize your sentence to the extent that things like mitigating factors we recognize are important because not everyone is fully responsible for the crimes they commit. The other kind of argument I flagged here is the kind of idea of double wrong. So in instances where you were led into a life of crime because of the state's failures, like failing to give you adequate education, there's an argument that punishing you very harshly in a retributive way then incurs a double moral wrong. The state first punished you by explicitly oppressing you or by denying through omission services that you needed, and then doubly punishes you for the consequences of the state's own failure. There's also a bunch of pragmatic reasons rehabilitation is good. The main gist is just A, it's good to focus on the causes of crime and trying to address them. Also B, you can make lots of very persuasive arguments why prison is a very difficult environment. People are often forced to join gangs as a means of protection. They're often develop drug addictions within prison. There's also a lot of just structural reasons why being in prison makes it very difficult to reintegrate. The fact that you lose economic skills, the fact that your support structures over time gradually fade away, but also when you're in prison, the people who you're hanging out with, hint, 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 are other people in prison who often tend to be, are criminals. And that means that the type of attitude you develop towards society is more criminal in nature. And therefore, just the longer that you spend in prison, the more likely you are to change in relatively harsh ways, not because you're a bad person per se, but because the structure of prison is quite bad. There's also a lot of problems like abuse, for example, within prison, especially within private prisons. You can also make arguments about just like generically why like in general, reintegration is important. So given that a lot of crime is often driven by socioeconomic deprivation, if people cannot successfully reintegrate back into society after they leave prison, that often puts them on a trajectory where they're just literally less capable of getting a job and getting the economic, welfare, et cetera, to be able to avoid falling back into things like gangs, et cetera. Okay. Yeah, this is like the Scandinavian prison system. It's gorgeous. guys, in case your life is ever really difficult, book a plane to Norway, commit like a low-level felony, like rob a bank, and then book yourself 5 years in a Scandinavian prison. Deterrence. I hate these arguments. I'm sorry. Don't take advice from me on deterrence argument. I hate deterrence arguments. There's a bunch of reasons I personally don't like them. You can read them there, but yeah, if you want to make deterrence arguments, go for it. TLDR, we try to disincentivize people from committing crime. It's very empirically speculative whether or not this works, but you can make the argument. Incapacitation is basically it's kind of funny because this is the most intuitive argument for like harsher sentences, for example, but no one likes to make it. The gist is like, you can make arguments that say like people are dangerous and therefore we should just lock them away to the extent they pose an ongoing threat to society. And you know who this dude is? It's a joke that he's attractive. He was like, he used to like look like really good. Yeah, you got it, David. David's on fire in these questions. This is the Unabomber. He blew up a bunch of people because they like supported technology and shit. He's now at like a maximum security prison. But like, for example, the argument for locking him away forever is because he like poses a threat to society. Because like he's like a genius mathematician who could probably invent a bunch of bombs and stuff. So incapacitation is another standard of criminal justice. So TLDR, there's 4 big standards that you can use whenever you're in any sort of criminal justice debates. How do we punish people for punishment's sake and give a sense of catharsis to society as well as possibly victims? How can we rehabilitate criminals, which admittedly often trades off with harsher or retributive conceptions of justice? How can we adequately deter people in the future from committing crime? And how can we ensure that actively dangerous individuals do not pose a continued threat to society? That basically is criminal justice for you. Interesting case study of this in case you want to look it up. I'm not going to talk about it now because we're running out of time, but feel free to look up the San Pedro prison system. Very interesting example. It's basically more or less a city within a prison. There's no guards internal within the system. It's a system that basically allows prisoners to more or less work jobs, buy and sell housing, goods. You're allowed to bring your family in. It's a very interesting system. Feel free to read about it. I'd strongly recommend you to. It's lots of fun. Kahoot time. Before we get to Kahoot though, any questions that folks want to ask? Oh, also, by the way, I know that I like sent out a bunch of motions that we didn't talk about. Like I will find a way to get other things to you later because they're, I don't know, I think it's quite interesting, honestly. And I think that there's like lots of interesting things that you can talk about in those motions. It's called I'll put it in chat. It's the San Pedro prison. It's a kind of interesting setup. Any other questions that folks want to ask? Okay, yeah, David.
Yeah. So, you gave like 4 metrics for weighing like systems of punishment. How would you weigh those 4 metrics between each other, and like which one would you say matters more?
Yeah, so retribution and deterrence are often quite compatible. Incapacitation tends to be a separate issue because in most instances, the context in which an individual poses a truly great threat to society are generally cases where we are locking someone away for so long that there isn't a real degree to which we're trying to rehabilitate them. And there's not a huge degree to which we're even like punishing them for punishment's sake. So the main dominant clash generally tends to be between rehabilitation versus retribution / deterrence. The major arguments you can make for why we should prioritize rehabilitation, actually, let me say this. I think the easiest way that you can weigh between any conception of justice is always through the lens, basically, of future victims, i.e., how can you limit harm to future victims? The weighing that, I know it's super stock, but it works. The weighing you can generally push is basically the best thing that we can do for victims that have already been wronged is mitigate the degree of suffering they face. The best thing that we could theoretically do for a future victim who has not already been wronged is to stop or prevent their suffering in the very first instance. So for example, the way that you can make arguments about like rehabilitation being better is that you fix the underlying structural problem, and then therefore better able to get things like, for example, reduced degrees of criminality in the future. So I think that the easiest way is like, absent a good argument from the other team on how they impact out to future victims, try to weigh on future victims. In case you're like weighing between those, the kind of very, very, very weird argument that I think can be kind of interesting. There's a weird weighing argument you can make for retribution, which is weird, but you can make an argument that retribution doesn't trade off with rehabilitation that much. And the harms of prison are not like basically spending more time in prison is not a priori bad if the quality of prison experience is substantially more rehabilitative. So there can kind of be an interesting argument you can make, which is that insofar as society generally does tend to glorify notions of vengeance, etc., in cases where you substantially reduce the severity of punishment, it often therefore decreases the political support for other measures that tend to be quite good for rehabilitation. So, for example, if you give very lenient sentences to individuals that struggle, for example, with mental health issues, it becomes politically, optically, rhetorically harder to also argue to give those individuals increased state support. And therefore, you can make arguments that counterintuitively, you need retributive conceptions of justice, at least on face, to create the political conditions necessary to argue for those rehabilitative systems. The flip side of that, on the rehabilitation being more important than retribution, you can also make arguments for retribution on the stuff I mentioned before about victims reporting. So the argument you can make is that almost any debate about the justice system presumes that we actually have caught, apprehended, and are now attempting to prosecute a criminal, and the question then just basically becomes like, how do we best prosecute you? Trivially, if someone gets off the hook and is never prosecuted, it ends up just being a much worse scenario because they commit crime again and again and again. The other thing on the flip side, which is how do you weigh rehabilitation over retribution? I think the easiest thing that you can just generally weigh on is just that you can talk about the specifically bad things that come from prison and talk about just the longer you spend in prison, the more likely you are to commit crime in the future. You can also make arguments, just generically speaking, about why, if you ever want to, like, this is weird weighing, but you can try to sometimes wash out the clash on what's best for decreasing the likelihood of recidivism from the individual criminal. And you can make interesting arguments that are basically, the more retributive a justice system is, the longer you lock people away for, that has third-party collateral consequences, which often also increase the likelihood of crime in other actors. So, for example, if you have a family whose dad gets locked away for 15 years for a low-level drug possession crime, that doesn't just affect the father, it also affects the mother, who now becomes a single mother, who becomes substantially more stressed and burdened. It also affects the kids who grew up without a strong father figure presence in their life. It also takes away the breadwinner from that family and therefore increases issues a la socioeconomic deprivation. So you can often make very good arguments, I think, just generically about why there are third-party harms to fully innocent individuals and stuff like that. You can obviously also, whenever weighing between any justice metric, you can also try to weigh victims as being most important. The general weighing you can give for why we should prioritize victims' interests above criminals' interests is that maybe it is true that criminals are not fully culpable of the wrong they've committed. They are presumably also more culpable of wrong compared to a fully innocent victim, which means that criminals have, to some capacity, consented to the punishment which befalls them. Comparatively, victims have done nothing wrong, and therefore we should prioritize their interests. So the most common debate that's set nowadays about criminal justice systems is like giving more influence to victims over sentencing, trials, whatever. The main argument you can make in those contexts is just giving autonomy to victims is good, like the thing I talked about before. Also, there's a different aspect of it, which is just independently, like, this is better for victims, and therefore we should care more about victims compared to criminals because they have committed a lesser degree of wrong, if that kind of helps, hopefully. Also, there's a question, could you explain plea bargaining? Yeah, sure. So basically the way that plea bargaining works, so Sophie, I'll pick on you. Can I pick on you, Sophie? I bet so.
Of course.
So Sophie, I'll pick on Sophie. So, okay, Sophie punches me, and then I'm like, ow. And then Sophie gets arrested, and the police arrest Sophie, and they're like, Sophie, we've arrested you, and they put Sophie in jail. And then Sophie, there's like a law that's like, if you punch someone, you're going to get sentenced to prison for 30 years. But then like a prosecutor who's going to try to convince a jury that we should convict Sophie because she's guilty basically comes to the jury, or the prosecutor, excuse me, and basically then talks to Sophie and is like, hey, Sophie, so you can go to trial, we'll try to prosecute you, and if we win, then you're going to go to prison for 30 years. But if you just agree to say that you're guilty, we can skip the whole trial part of we can skip the whole are you guilty or innocent thing because you've conceded you're guilty. And in exchange for just skipping that whole mess of a trial thing, we'll just skip right to the sentencing part, and we'll only sentence you, instead of 30 years to jail, we'll only sentence you to 10 years in jail. So the benefit of plea bargains from the defendant's perspective is that you go to prison for a lesser amount of time, but it also means that you definitely go to prison with a high degree of certainty, Whereas going to trial actually means that there is a jury that listens to the evidence and determines whether or not you're guilty or innocent, stuff like that. The idea of plea bargaining is that you short circuit that, you eliminate the whole jury part, and you just skip right to the sentencing part. The classic argument for jury duties, it basically decreases court clog and increases efficiency within the judicial system. It means that you're able to get, 90 some odd % of cases just get resolved and skip right to sentencing. Comparatively, the argument, like the best, most common argument against them is basically, this is often used very coercively by prosecutors to basically bully and strong arm innocent people into accepting plea bargains, even when arguably they'd have a fine shot of potentially getting acquitted by a jury if they went through to trial. But they're scared at the idea of being locked away for 20, 30, 40 years. And prosecutors kind of use very fear-mongering rhetoric to convince you of that, and therefore innocent people go to prison, if that kind of makes sense. Other questions that folks want to ask? Oh, also hype up NYPDL camp. Go NYPDL camp. Woohoo, woohoo. We love you, NYPDL camp. Go NYPDL. It's like a free summer camp, like August 8th to 10th or something. I'll be teaching there. It'll be very fun. Wait, am I teaching there, Sophie? I think so. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.